Number 1. Caligula's War on the Sea. Picture the northern coast of Gaul in the year 40 AD. A Roman emperor has marched thousands of soldiers to the edge of the channel, and the men expect an invasion of Britain. Instead, the emperor points at the water and orders them to attack it. He tells his legionaries to draw their swords against the waves, and then to gather seashells. The shells, he declares, are the spoils of the ocean, owed to the Capitol and the Palatine in Rome. Our main source for this is Suetonius, who wrote his lives of the emperors around 121 AD, and Cassius Dio gives a matching account of soldiers scooping shells into their helmets. Suetonius even says Caligula built a tall tower on the spot to mark the victory, and some scholars connect that claim to the real Roman lighthouse at Boulogne, the Tour d'Ordre, which stood until the 17th century. Now, how much of this actually happened? The Latin word Suetonius uses is conche, meaning shells, but some historians argue it could be a garbled reference to engineers' huts or small boats. The writer Robert Graves suggested the whole episode was a punishment, a humiliation of troops who had mutinied. Others read it as pure theater, an emperor claiming dominion over the sea itself, echoing the Persian king Xerxes, who once ordered the Hellespont whipped for wrecking his bridge. The historian Mary Beard reminds us that nearly everything we know about Caligula comes from writers who despised him, working decades after his death, with no contemporary record to check against. And yet, Caligula did real, documented things that sound just as strange. A year earlier, in 39 AD, he built a 2-mile bridge of ships across the Bay of Baiae and rode a horse across it, apparently to mock a prophecy. He tried to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, into a priest. He declared himself a living god. Retrospective diagnoses of encephalitis, hyperthyroidism, or lead poisoning have all been proposed, and all remain guesses. Caligula was assassinated in January of 41 AD, and the real conquest of Britain came 2 years later under Claudius. So the maddest story on this list may be exaggeration. But if that one is uncertain, what about the stories we actually can verify? Number 2. Elagabalus and the Rose Petals. Here is one of the most beautiful and disturbing images from ancient Rome. A teenage emperor hosts a banquet. Above the reclining guests hangs a reversible ceiling, packed with flower petals. At a signal, the panels open, and a soft avalanche of violets and roses pours down. It keeps pouring. Guests laugh, then struggle, then suffocate, buried alive under blossoms because they cannot crawl free. The emperor is Elagabalus, who ruled from 218 to 222 AD and took the throne at about 14. This story comes from the Historia Augusta, a late Roman collection of imperial biographies that scholars consider partly fictional. The historian Ronald Syme argued that much of its Elagabalus material is invented moralizing. The painter Lawrence Alma Tadema turned the scene into a famous canvas in 1888, using real roses shipped from the Riviera, and that painting is why the image sticks in our minds. So did it happen? Probably not as told. But here is the twist. The technology behind it was real. The Emperor Nero, more than a century earlier, built dining rooms in his golden house with rotating ivory ceilings that dropped flowers and sprayed perfume through hidden pipes. Suetonius describes those panels in detail, and archaeologists have studied the golden house itself. Rome had a booming rose industry, importing winter blooms from Egypt. The mechanism that could smother a room in petals genuinely existed. What we can verify about Elagabalus is damning enough without the murders. He was the hereditary priest of a Syrian sun god, and he moved that god's sacred black meteorite to the center of Roman worship, deeply offending the traditional elite. Cassius Dio, a contemporary senator and a more careful source than the Historia Augusta, reports that he even married a Vestal virgin, a shocking violation of one of Rome's oldest religious taboos. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, engineered his rise and then his fall. In 222 AD, the Praetorian Guard murdered him and his mother, dragged their bodies through the streets, and threw them in the Tiber. The smothering story sits at the invented end of the spectrum. The sun cult sits at the certain end. And that gap between what a culture believed and what actually happened is exactly what makes ancient history so slippery. Which brings us to a monument where the physics leaves no room for doubt. Number 3. The Behistun Inscription. In the mountains of western Iran, on the old royal road between Babylon and Ecbatana, there is a cliff, and carved into that cliff, roughly 100 meters up, is one of the most audacious pieces of propaganda ever made. Around 520 BC, the Persian king Darius I had his life story cut into the sheer rock face, in 3 languages at once, at a height no human could reach. The relief shows Darius with his foot planted on a fallen usurper named Gaumata, facing 9 rebel leaders roped together at the neck, all beneath the winged symbol of the god Ahura Mazda. The text runs about 1,200 lines and boasts that Darius crushed 19 rebellions and killed 9 so-called lying kings in a single year. After the carving was finished, the workers reportedly cut away the ledge they had stood on, so no one could ever alter or reach it. Think about that. A king spent enormous effort to write a message that no reader below could actually read. It was meant to speak to eternity, not to passing travelers. The 3 languages were Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, and that trilingual format made Behistun the key to a lost world. It became the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform. Between 1835 and 1843, a British officer named Henry Creswick Rawlinson scaled the cliff again and again on ladders and ropes to copy the text. For the most dangerous overhang, he hired a local Kurdish boy who climbed the bare rock and pressed papier-mâché squeezes against the Babylonian section. Rawlinson's decipherment in the 1840s cracked cuneiform open and founded the field of Assyriology, building on earlier partial work by Georg Friedrich Grotefend in 1802. There is even a mystery inside the message. Was Gaumata a real usurper, or a fiction Darius invented to justify seizing the throne? Herodotus, the Greek historian, tells a parallel version of the same succession crisis, letting us compare 2 accounts. UNESCO made Behistun a World Heritage Site in 2006, and laser scanning now records it in detail. A king carved words no one could read up close. But around the same era, a librarian used nothing but a shadow to measure the entire planet. Number 4. Eratosthenes measures the Earth. Around 240 BC, a Greek scholar named Eratosthenes of Cyrene did something that still sounds impossible. Working as the chief librarian of the Great Library of Alexandria, he measured the circumference of the Earth using a stick, a shadow, and geometry. Follow his logic with me, because it is elegant. Eratosthenes knew that in the city of Syene, far to the south, the sun shone straight down a well at noon on the summer solstice, casting no shadow at all. Syene sat almost exactly on the Tropic of Cancer. On the same day, in Alexandria to the north, a vertical stick did cast a shadow. He measured its angle at about 7.2 degrees. Now 7.2 degrees is 1/50th of a full circle. If he assumed the 2 cities lay on the same north-south line, and that the sun's rays arrive parallel because the sun is so far away, then the distance between the cities had to be 1/50th of the Earth's whole circumference. The distance from Syene to Alexandria was reported as about 5,000 stadia, possibly paced out by professional surveyors called bimetists. 5,000 times 50 gives 250,000 stadia, which he rounded to 252,000. The catch is that we do not know exactly how long a stadion was, somewhere between 157 and 185 meters. Using the Egyptian value, His answer comes out to about 39,375 kilometers. The true figure is about 40,075. He was within roughly 2%, using no instruments beyond a stick and his mind. His own book on the measurement is lost, and we know the method through a later writer named Cleomades. Eratosthenes also invented the sieve of Eratosthenes, still taught for finding prime numbers, drew a world map with lines of latitude and longitude, and calculated the tilt of the Earth's axis. The Greeks already accepted a spherical Earth, thanks to Aristotle's arguments a century before, drawn from the way ships vanish hull first over the horizon and the way Earth casts a round shadow on the moon during an eclipse. What Eratosthenes did was turn a theory into a hard number. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus would rely on a rival, much smaller estimate of the Earth's size, which is part of why he badly underestimated the distance to Asia. Students recreate Eratosthenes' experiment today, often on the equinox, and land within a few percent, measured to the percent, and still it sounds unbelievable. But a queen's party trick sounds even less credible, and modern chemistry says it too is real. Number 5. Cleopatra's dissolved pearl. Cleopatra VII, the last active pharaoh of Egypt, once made a bet that she could spend 10 million sesterces on a single dinner. Her guest was the Roman general Mark Antony, and the story comes from Pliny, the Elder's Natural History, written around 77 AD. To win the wager, Cleopatra removed one of a pair of enormous pearls from her earrings. The pair was said to be worth 60 million sesterces, a sum almost beyond imagining. She dropped the pearl into a cup of strong vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank it down. The referee of the bet, a Roman named Lucius Manatius Plancus, declared Antony the loser before she could dissolve the second pearl. That surviving twin, Pliny says, was later cut in half to decorate the ears of a statue of Venus in Rome. For centuries, this read as pure legend. Then, in 2010, a classic scholar named Prudence Jones at Montclair State University actually tested it. Pearls are mostly calcium carbonate, and calcium carbonate reacts with the acetic acid in vinegar. So a pearl can indeed dissolve. In ordinary 5% table vinegar, the process is slow, but it speeds up if the vinegar is boiled or concentrated, or if the pearl is crushed or pre-treated first. The reaction produces calcium acetate, water, and carbon dioxide, leaving a fizzing, drinkable, if unpleasant, liquid. Jones concluded the story is chemically possible, though the timing suggests Cleopatra staged it with some preparation rather than a single instant gesture. Everything else fits what we know. Cleopatra was famously educated and a master of political theater. Roman writers like Horace painted her as a decadent Eastern seductress, part of the propaganda war that Augustus waged after defeating her and Antony at Actium. Pearls from the Red Sea and Persian Gulf were the supreme luxury of the ancient world, prized above gold. Vinegar was an everyday Roman drink base called pasca. A nearly identical tale is even told of a Roman spendthrift named Clodius, hinting that the story was a floating motif. But the core act, dissolving a pearl and drinking it, is physically real, which takes us from a feat of showmanship to a feat of raw logistics that still stuns generals today. Number 6. Hannibal's War, Elephants Cross the Alps. In 218 BC, the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca did what Rome believed no one could do. He marched an army out of Spain, across the Pyrenees, over the Rhone River, and straight over the frozen Alps to invade Italy from the north, and he brought war elephants. The ancient historians Polybius and Livy record that he started with 37 or 38 of them, alongside roughly 50 to 60,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Polybius is the more trustworthy source, because he interviewed survivors and retraced parts of the route himself. The crossing took about 15 days, probably in October and November, when the passes were already deep in snow and ice. Hannibal's men were ambushed by hostile Gallic tribes, buried by landslides, and stopped by a rockfall that blocked the path entirely. Livy describes soldiers heating the rock with fire and then dousing it with vinegar to crack it apart, a detail historians still debate. Most of the elephants survived the mountains, but many died in the following months from cold and disease. They were probably North African forest elephants, a smaller subspecies now extinct, and ancient sources name one survivor, an elephant called Surus, meaning the Syrian. For centuries, no one knew which pass he used, and it remains one of history's great geography puzzles, with candidates including the Col de la Traversette and the Col du Clapier. Then, in 2016, a team led by the geoscientist Bill Mahaney found something remarkable at the Traversette, a churned-up layer of horse and mule dung dated to around 218 BC, packed with Clostridia bacteria spores of the kind left by mass animal passage. Physical evidence, in the dirt, for the crossing. Hannibal's gamble worked. By striking from the undefended north, he bypassed Rome's naval power and won crushing victories at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, and at Cannae, where he annihilated a far larger Roman army. He never took the city of Rome itself, and was finally defeated by Scipio Africanus at Zama in 202 BC. Napoleon studied the crossing. Military academies still do. And now, field science backs it up. From an army on the ice, we turn to a front-row senator who watched an emperor debase himself in the arena. Number 7. Commodus fights in the Colosseum. The Emperor Commodus, son of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, did something no Roman could quite believe. He stepped into the Colosseum himself and fought as a gladiator and a beast hunter in front of 50,000 spectators. Our best witness is Cassius Dio, a senator who was actually there, forced to sit in the front rows and watch. Commodus believed he was a reincarnation of Hercules, and he dressed the part, draping himself in a lion skin and carrying a club. Dio says he killed 100 bears in a single day, shooting them from a raised, safe platform. He beheaded ostriches with special crescent-shaped arrowheads, and once walked up to the senators holding a severed ostrich head, waving it as a silent threat. The historian Herodian confirms the obsession, and it was expensive. Commodus charged the Roman treasury 1 million sesterces every time he appeared, draining the state's finances. His fights were rigged. His opponents carried blunted or wooden weapons, or were already wounded, so he was never in real danger, and he boasted of more than 700 victories. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles, and even renamed the city of Rome itself Colonia Commodiana. The year 2000 film Gladiator dramatized him, though its plot is invented. His reign is traditionally marked as the end of the 5 good emperors, and the start of Rome's long slide into instability, the thesis Edward Gibbon made famous. He survived several assassination plots, including one led by his own sister Lucilla in 182 AD. Finally, on the last day of 192 AD, his wrestling partner Narcissus strangled him in his bath. Now, we should be clear about the background. Gladiatorial combat was not the chaotic free-for-all of movies. It was a highly organized institution, with training schools, ranks, and celebrity fighters. Osteological studies of gladiator cemeteries, like the one excavated at Ephesus, reveal structured combat wounds and even specialized medical care. Against that ordered world, an emperor voluntarily entering the sand inverted every Roman norm, which is exactly why hostile sources recorded it so vividly. An emperor in the arena is well documented. So is a scholar who sailed a fleet straight toward an erupting volcano. Number 8. Pliny the Elder sails into Vesuvius. Pliny the Elder was a Roman naval commander and the author of a 37-book encyclopedia called the Natural History, one of the largest works to survive from antiquity. In the year 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying the cities of Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Stabiae. Pliny commanded the imperial fleet at Misenum, on the far side of the Bay of Naples, and he had a clear view of the disaster. What he did next is why we remember him. We know the story from 2 letters written by his nephew, Pliny the Younger, about 25 years later, to the historian Tacitus. The younger Pliny describes the eruption column rising like a Mediterranean umbrella pine, a comparison so precise that volcanologists now call this type of eruption Plinian in his honor. Pliny the Elder first set out simply to observe the phenomenon up close, as a scientist. Then a message arrived from a friend named Rectina, begging for rescue, and he turned the mission into an evacuation. He ordered his warships across the bay toward Stabiae as ash, pumice, and hot stones rained down on the decks. When he reached shore, he deliberately stayed calm to reassure everyone, bathing, dining, even sleeping. The next morning, overcome by toxic fumes and falling ash near the beach, he collapsed and died, most likely from asphyxiation, perhaps worsened by a weak chest. His body was found 3 days later, said to look more like sleep than death. The scale of what he faced is staggering. The eruption released thermal energy estimated at 100,000 times the Hiroshima bomb. Superheated clouds of gas and debris, called pyroclastic surges, killed the residents of Herculaneum almost instantly, and their skeletons show the signs of extreme heat. A charcoal inscription found at Pompeii, reading October 17th, has led some scholars to move the eruption date later than the traditional August 24th. From 1863, the archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli poured plaster into the cavities left by decayed bodies, capturing the victims in their final poses. Vesuvius is still active, and roughly 3 million people live in its danger zone today. Pliny may be the first scientist in recorded history to die studying a natural disaster up close. He died delivering knowledge, and a runner, the legend says, died delivering a single message. Number 9. Pheidippides and the first marathon. Almost everyone knows the story. After the Athenians defeated a much larger Persian army at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC, a single messenger ran the roughly 40 kilometers back to Athens, gasped out the word victory, and dropped dead on the spot. It is the origin of the modern marathon race. But the real history is stranger, and in a way more incredible, than the legend. The dying runner story appears in Plutarch around 100 AD, and in Lucian in the 2nd century AD, writers who lived 500 years or more after the battle. They cannot even agree on the runner's name, calling him Pheidippides, or Thersippus, or Eucles. Our closest source, Herodotus, wrote around 440 BC, within living memory of the events, and he tells a completely different story. In Herodotus, Pheidippides is a professional long-distance runner, a hemerodromos, sent before the battle from Athens to Sparta to beg for military aid. That run covered about 240 kilometers, 150 miles, in roughly 2 days. Along the way, Herodotus says, Pheidippides met the god Pan, who asked why the Athenians neglected his worship. And crucially, Herodotus never mentions any runner dying after the battle. The famous death scene simply is not in the earliest account. Historians think the later legend may have absorbed a different real event, the exhausting forced march of the entire Athenian army back to the city, to defend it before the Persian fleet could sail around and attack. The modern marathon was invented for the first modern Olympics in Athens in 1896, proposed by a scholar named Michel Breal. The oddly specific distance of 42.195 kilometers was only fixed at the London Olympics in 1908 to place the finish line in front of the royal box. Today, an ultramarathon called the Spartathlon retraces the real route from Athens to Sparta after a British officer named John Foden proved it could be run in 1982. At Marathon itself, a burial mound called the Soros still holds the bones of the roughly 192 Athenians who died, excavated in the 1890s. The name Pheidippides even shows up as an unrelated character in Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds, a reminder of how loosely these names floated through Greek culture. So, the real Pheidippides ran twice as far as the myth, and probably did not die at all. A myth grew from a real runner, and a different myth, everyone agreed, grew from nothing, until someone dug up the city underneath it. Number 10. Schliemann digs up Troy. For most of history, the city of Troy was considered pure poetry, the invented setting of Homer's Iliad. Then a German businessman refused to believe it was fiction. Heinrich Schliemann made fortunes in indigo dye, in California gold rush banking, and in military supply during the Crimean War, and he poured that money into a single obsession. He took Homer literally as a geographic guide and set out to find the real Troy. Guided by a British expatriate named Frank Calvert, who owned part of the site and had already identified it, Schliemann began digging into the mound of Hisarlik in northwest Turkey in 1870. What he found was astonishing and messy. Hisarlik was not one city, but at least 9, stacked on top of each other, spanning from around 3000 BC to Roman times, labeled Troy 1 through Troy 9. Schliemann dug crudely, trenching straight down and destroying later layers in his rush to reach what he assumed was Homer's city. In 1873, he uncovered a hoard of gold, silver, and copper he named Priam's treasure, after the legendary Trojan king. He photographed his Greek wife Sophia wearing the so-called jewels of Helen. But he was wrong about the date. That treasure belonged to Troy II, around 2400 BC, more than 1,000 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War. He smuggled it out of the Ottoman Empire, sparking a legal dispute that still smolders. The hoard was displayed in Berlin, seized by the Soviet Army in 1945, and sits in Moscow's Pushkin Museum to this day. Later, careful archaeologists changed the picture. The layers called Troy 6 and Troy 7a, dating to around 1300 to 1180 BC, are the best candidates for a Homeric Troy, and Troy 7a shows destruction by fire, scattered arrowheads, and hastily buried bodies, all signs of war. Hittite diplomatic texts mention a city called Wilusa, linked to the Greek Ilios, and a king named Alexandru, echoing Homer's Alexandros, another name for Paris. Excavations by Carl Blegen and later Manfred Korfmann revealed a large lower town, a real trading city that controlled the Dardanelles. Schliemann exaggerated and possibly faked some details, but the core is undeniable. The myth had roots, in fact. So what makes any of these 10 stories survive at all? The honest answer starts with a problem. Between the moment something happened and the moment we read about it, there is almost always a long, fragile chain. Consider how late our sources often are. Suetonius wrote about Caligula some 80 years after his death. Cassius, Dio, and Herodian wrote about Commodus a generation or more after the fact. The Historia Augusta, our source for the rose petal smothering, was compiled centuries later and is riddled with invention. Against those, we can weigh genuine eyewitnesses. Pliny the Younger actually watched Vesuvius erupt. Cassius Dio actually sat in the Colosseum. The best ancient historians worked hard to get it right. Polybius interviewed survivors of Hannibal's campaign and retraced the route. Herodotus traveled widely, collecting oral testimony wherever he went. But even a well-written scroll had to survive to reach us, and most did not. Eratosthenes' own book on measuring the earth is lost. We know his method only because a later writer quoted it. Countless ancient works vanished entirely, surviving only as fragments embedded in other authors. Much of what did survive came through a long relay of medieval copyists, monks in European scriptoria, and scholars in the Islamic world who preserved and recopied Greek and Roman texts across centuries when the originals had long since crumbled. This is why inscriptions matter so much. The Behistun text was cut into a cliff, and stone and metal outlast papyrus and parchment by millennia. Then there is the problem of motive. Darius carved Behistun as propaganda. Augustus shaped the image of Cleopatra to justify his conquest of Egypt. The writers who recorded Caligula, Commodus, and Elagabalus mostly hated their subjects. A single hostile source is weak evidence. But when several independent sources agree, as they do for Hannibal, confidence rises sharply. Transmission explains how these stories reached us. It does not by itself tell us which ones are true. For that, we need to leave the library and pick up a spade. This is where ancient history becomes a physical science. Again and again, archaeology and chemistry have taken a story that sounded like fantasy and turned it into evidence you can hold. Hannibal's crossing is the clearest case. That churned layer of animal dung at the Col de la Traversette, packed with Clostridia spores and dated to around 218 BC, is a physical fingerprint of tens of thousands of animals moving through a mountain pass at exactly the right moment. At Troy, the destruction layer of Troy 7a gives us arrowheads embedded in walls and bodies buried in haste, the archaeology of a real siege, and Hittite tablets independently name a city that matches Homer's. Cleopatra's pearl went from myth to demonstrated chemistry the day Prudence Jones dissolved one in her lab. At Vesuvius, Giuseppe Fiorelli's plaster casts froze the victims in their final gestures, and skeletons at Herculaneum still carry the mark of pyroclastic heat. The gladiator cemetery at Ephesus, with its patterned combat wounds and healed injuries, confirms that the arena world Commodus entered was exactly as organized as the texts describe. At Marathon, the Soros Mound still holds the Athenian dead. Rawlinson's physical squeezes made Behistun readable and cracked cuneiform. Students with a stick and a sunny day reproduce Eratosthenes' result within a few percent. Even a scrap of charcoal graffiti at Pompeii, reading October 17th, may have rewritten the date of the most famous eruption in history. Physical evidence has limits. It can confirm that an event happened, but it rarely recovers a person's exact words or true motives. The strongest proof comes when three things converge: the written account, the object in the ground, and the chemistry in the lab. When all three agree, a story that once sounded like fantasy becomes as solid as any fact in a textbook. That is the quiet revolution of modern archaeology, that it can reach back across 2,000 years and test a rumor. And where that evidence runs out, we are left with honest questions. For all our tools, real uncertainty remains, and it runs right through these 10 stories. Did Caligula truly order his men to gather seashells as war spoils, or is that a cruel invention by writers who despised him? Was Elagabalus's flower smothering an actual event, or a fable from an unreliable book? Was Gaumata, the usurper Darius claims to have killed, a genuine rival or a convenient fiction to justify a coup? Exactly how long did Cleopatra's pearl take to dissolve, and how much did she prepare in advance? Which Alpine pass did Hannibal actually use, when several still fit the evidence? Was Vesuvius destroyed in August or October of 79 AD? Did any runner really die after the Battle of Marathon, or did the legend stitch together two separate events? How honest was Schliemann about the moment he found his treasure? Even Eratosthenes leaves us guessing, because we do not know the exact length of the unit he measured in, which is why his accuracy can be stated only as a range. And beneath all of these cites one unrecoverable gap: the space between a claim written down and the physical event behind it. What is striking is how some absurd-sounding stories check out under scrutiny while others dissolve. That pattern is a warning against two opposite mistakes: believing everything and dismissing everything. New technology keeps reopening questions we thought were closed. The uncertainty is not a failure. It is what keeps the past alive and worth arguing about. And that argument tells us something about the people who first told these tales. Ask why an ancient writer bothered to record a story, and the stories start to make a different kind of sense. Ancient historians did not write only to preserve facts. They wrote to teach moral lessons, to flatter or attack the powerful, and simply to capture wonder. The tale of the mad tyrant at war with the sea shaped how Caligula, Commodus, and Elagabalus were all remembered, because a ruler whose madness turns against nature itself makes a powerful warning. The opposite trope, the hero who sacrifices himself for knowledge, shaped Pliny the Elder and Eratosthenes into figures of noble curiosity. Cleopatra became a mirror for Roman fears about wealth, luxury, and the seductive East. Hannibal and Schliemann survive as figures of sheer, reckless will, men who attempted the impossible and partly succeeded. The Greek reverence for the professional runner turned an ordinary courier into a legend. Propaganda, too, built narratives that lasted, from Darius on his cliff to Augustus reshaping the memory of Actium. Ancient biography freely blended fact, rumor, and fable, because the line between what a culture believed and what actually happened was never sharp. When we translate their world into ours, 10 million sesterces, a stadion of distance, 100 bears in an afternoon, we start to feel the scale they lived at. And we can see the learning curve behind every feat, the centuries of shipbuilding behind Hannibal's crossing, the geometry behind Eratosthenes' shadow. These stories still grip us because the real past is stranger and more human than any fiction, which leaves one last question worth sitting with. What should we actually believe? Line these 10 stories up, and they spread across a spectrum. At one end sit the things we can be almost certain of. Eratosthenes measured the earth. Hannibal crossed the Alps. Troy was a real city. At the other end sit the tales that are probably embellished or invented. The smothering banquet, perhaps the war on the sea. And many fall somewhere in between, half fact and half performance, like a pearl dissolving in a cup. The lesson is not to swallow every ancient story whole, nor is it to sneer at all of them as fairy tales. The lesson is that dismissing a story as too wild to be true is just as risky as believing it without question. What separates the real from the ornamental is patient work, converging sources, named researchers, hard science, and the willingness to dig. Each of these 10 tales earned its place on a different rung of that ladder, and knowing which rung is the whole art of reading the ancient world. The record survives at all only through a fragile mix of stone, careful copying, lucky quotation, and stubborn curiosity. And the ancient world it reveals is not some alien place. It is continuous with our own appetite for spectacle, for glory, for folly on a grand scale. Emperors raging at the tide, queens drinking fortunes, elephants picking their way across the ice. There is no neat moral to tie it all off. There is only the enduring strangeness of the real past, and the plain fact that, more often than we expect, the truth turns out to be stranger than the myth.